this talk that remarks that I'm going to give for you today are taken from a new book that I've written that's coming out in another month. And it is a book written for a non-academic audience, which is a funny thing for an academic to do. But it's a book written for a general audience and looking at the sort of state of gay rights at this moment. And one of the reasons I wrote this book is that the moment we're in now is markedly different, as everyone who has eyes can see, is markedly different than the one any of us grew up in. And I think there's a general story going on in our culture. And the story goes something like this. Back in the old days, things were terrible. And, gay people were oppressed and in the closet, and it was a terrible time. And now we are in a new moment, a new era of tolerance, a new rainbow world where everything has changed. And gay people are welcomed into the fullness of American culture without any reservations. And part of what I wanted to do in this book was challenge that idea, because I think it is a prevalent myth we have. Now, don't get me wrong, things have changed. I came out about 35 years ago now. It's a long time ago, and I was a teenager when I came out, and I never dreamed the world would be like it is today. And that's absolutely true, and I don't want to underplay that in any way. We have, at last count, in fact, my book is unfortunately already outdated with these statistics, 17 states in which gay marriage is legal. We have huge changes in public attitudes, the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the anti-discrimination policy in the military. States around the country have anti-discrimination statutes. Businesses and localities do as well. There are more openly gay politicians and celebrities. The hottest sitcom on television features a gay male couple, Modern Family, and their child. We have out gay football players, etc., etc. As one blogger put it recently, supporting gay rights is fashionable. I'm not sure if that's true, but I think I would not at all want to deny the huge changes. But I think Americans tend to have rather short historical memories, or at least to be overly eager to proclaim victory over long-standing injustices. So, for example, we bandy about terms like post-feminism, because some changes have occurred in women's rights. Or we declare we are post-racial since we have elected an African-American president. We are doing the same thing, I believe, with gay rights. So the trick, I think, for all of us is to acknowledge the real shifts and changes that have occurred, to celebrate them, and simultaneously to recognize the work still to be done. But part of what is going on now, I think, is that the discourse, and I'll talk about this in a minute, the discourse of tolerance, the framework of tolerance, undermines our potential to really move forward. In other words, the whole idea of tolerance stops us short of crossing the finish line and really developing a more robust, more substantive inclusion of gays and lesbians into American culture. So I want to make three major points here about the state of gay rights in the U.S. The first point against this idea that everything's changed so much is that things just aren't better enough for enough people. Things just aren't better enough for enough people. Gay youth are disproportionately likely to commit suicide. There's a disproportionate number of gay homeless youth. We still have not been able to pass non-discrimination legislation in our government, what's called the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. There is still, in fact, there's been a rise of anti-gay violence and hate crimes. In 2008, for example, a 15-year-old gay boy was shot to death by a classmate. In 2010, a college student jumped off a bridge to his death after he was videotaped having sex with another man. In 2010, again, 2 gay teenage boys in the Midwest killed themselves. Again, in 2010, 3 men in the Bronx in New York were abducted and brutalized, in fact tortured, by a gang whose only apparent motivation was so-called punishment for their perceived homosexuality. 2011 had the highest number of murders of gay people ever reported, and the list goes on. So that's part of the picture we have to look at when we talk about this new tolerant America, is that strikingly in this period of time in which we see these enormous changes going on, we also see the persistence of anti-gay hatred and the persistence of anti-gay laws and the persistence of violence. So that's one point, is that step back a minute and look at this continued violence. Things haven't changed enough for us to declare this battle won. Number 2 is that the gains that have been made, and they have been made, should not be seen as the end point of gay rights. So, for example, I think a dominant idea circulating now by our pundits, in the popular media, is that gay marriage plus the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, plus lots of gay characters on television equals gay rights. In fact, one of the things that's always struck me, and one of the things that motivated me to write this book, is that if you go online now and you Google gay rights, what you're going to get again and again and again is gay marriage. And so one of the things I want us to think about is, what does it mean for a huge social movement, which is about a lot of things and a lot of different notions of rights and responsibilities and so on? What does it mean for a social movement to be reduced to one single right? It's an important right. There's no question about it. The right to be treated equal in the country in which you live in. But when that becomes the sum total of how we think about gay rights, it's a problem. It's as if the sum total of racial equality was the Voting Rights Act. It's not. Right? Really belonging to a society, feeling fully included in a society is much deeper than that, goes much deeper than that. And so part of the problem now is that we're at a place historically in which everything has been put on, all our eggs have been put in the gay marriage basket. And we look at that as a culture, we look at that as a sign that the battle's over. Look at what the Supreme Court decisions were. Look at the numbers of states that are continuously ruling in favor of same-sex marriage, and we think the battle is won. But again, I have to say, at the same time that we see that, we also see a rise in hate crimes. We see an inability to pass employment discrimination law. So it's a murkier picture than it initially appears to be. And my third point is that the framing of gay rights around tolerance and acceptance forestalls addressing deeper and more challenging questions posed by full, or what I would talk about as robust, inclusion. That we're not just limited by tolerance, but trapped by it. So, what's wrong with tolerance? I mean, isn't tolerance a good thing? Everyone wants to be thought of as being a tolerant person. The late Middle English origins of the word, in fact, indicate the ability to bear pain and hardship. In more contemporary times, we speak of having a tolerance to something as the capacity to endure continued subjection to it. A plant, a drug, without adverse reactions. We speak of people, for example, who have a high tolerance for pain, or worry about a generation developing a tolerance for a certain type of antibiotic because of overuse. In more scientific usages, it refers to the allowable amount of variation of a specified quantity. So the point here is that tolerance almost always implies or assumes something negative or undesired, or even a variation contained and circumscribed. The crucial point here is that it doesn't make sense to say we tolerate something unless we think there's something a little wrong with it. We don't say, oh, I tolerated this beautiful sunny day. I tolerated just this delicious meal I ate. I tolerated the good friendship of my colleagues. We say, I say as a professor, I tolerated all that grading I had to do. Or, I tolerated that boring meeting. Or I tolerated the cold of a New England winter. So we tolerate that which we really don't love. Tolerance is not about an embrace. It's about a begrudging acceptance. And so that's part of my problem with the notion of tolerance. In addition, historically, no social movement worth its salt has asked for tolerance to get social change and to be included. So the great social movements of our time, the movement for racial equality, for example, the movements for gender equality, have not said, oh, I hope you tolerate my skin color. I hope you tolerate, my gender. Groups that have been excluded have asked for inclusion, demanded integration, demanded belonging to the world in which you live in, a deep sense of belonging, a sense of not acceptance and tolerance, but a celebration of the very difference you offer. So historically, groups have never argued for integration and inclusion on the basis of tolerance. Individual civil rights, like marriage rights, are core to this project, but are not the whole of it. We know that gaining those rights can provide safety and legitimacy and can also change hearts and minds. But we also know that, for example, the civil rights movement ended legal segregation in America, but it didn't build an integrated America. So tolerance has nothing to do, I would argue, with that project of real integration. Tolerance, the discourse of tolerance, only constricts. It doesn't open up. And it's actually interesting to me that we have a very lively discourse on tolerance right now. And we talk about being in a more tolerant world, but we're simultaneously reluctant to talk about the continuation of anti-gay bigotry. Let me give you an example of how tolerance is a trap. Now, let me stop for one moment here before I do that, because I think a lot of people would argue that, okay, maybe you're right about tolerance, that tolerance is not the same as real inclusion and celebration of people's difference, right? That you do tolerate, tolerance is not a very welcoming term to talk about social change. But many would argue, well, it's the step in that direction, right? First you go to tolerance, and then you go to real inclusion. So it is just part of that forward movement. I'm actually arguing something different here, which is that the language of tolerance stops us short. It's like it puts the bar too low. So we believe now, and I can't tell you how many, in doing the research for this book, how many of our pundits, our media professionals claim over and over again, we are now a more tolerant society. There is no more need for a gay rights movement. The end is there. Right? Victory is here. And in fact, there was a book recently on the state of the gay rights movement that was called Victory. So I think the language of tolerance is part of the problem, not part of the solution. I think the language of tolerance sets that bar so low that we look at the gains we've got. We say, oh, gay marriage, okay, we're more tolerant. End of story. And it stops us from moving forward as a nation, of really embracing the challenges that varying social groups offer to our society at large. And let me give you an example, though, of how tolerance does trap us in this way. There was a recent Gallup poll, and I came across this in my email inbox. Someone had emailed to me, and I did think for a moment it was a headline from a satirical magazine, something like The Onion, that it was a joke because of what it is now. And here's the quote from the sort of summary of this poll. For a third year, majority says gay-lesbian relations are morally acceptable. Now, it's hard to know whether to laugh or cry at such a declaration. Have no doubt, this is being reported as evidence of our new tolerance. And in fact, the rest of the byline goes, U.S. acceptance of gay-lesbian relations is the new normal. Part of the problem with that, of course, is that someone, not gays presumably, is adjudicating the moral acceptability and normalcy of gayness. So gays are accepted as they are reminded that their very existence, their acceptability, is contingent on someone else deeming it so. Someone else who needs no accepting, whose moral certitude needs no certification. Someone whose citizenship precedes and excludes gayness because gayness is something that they can decide whether or not to tolerate, whether or not to accept, right? You can always take it away. Tolerance can always be untolerated. And here's an example of that. A few weeks ago, Minnesota Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, who has a long history of all kinds of anti-gay sentiment, made a comment when she was responding to the veto that Arizona Governor Jan Brewer vetoed some very awful anti-gay legislation that had gone through the Arizona House. And Jan Brewer vetoed it. And Michelle Bachmann was upset about the veto. And she said this, referring to the veto. She said, "I'm sorry that she made the decision. And it's because I believe that tolerance is a two-way street and we need to respect everyone's rights, including the rights of people who have sincerely held religious beliefs. Right now," she said, and this is again quoting from Bachmann, "there's a terrible intolerance afoot in the United States, and it's against people who hold sincerely held religious beliefs." So here you have a language of tolerance and intolerance being utilized to critique someone who vetoed anti-gay legislation. It is slippery language, tolerance. It's not, I guess what I'm trying to say is, tolerance is not up to the job of embracing the difference that gay people offer to American culture. And I want to counterpose that statement of someone like Michelle Bachmann with an earlier statement from the earlier gay rights movement that I think really shows you something quite different, a different vision of sexual and gender freedom and liberation. And this is from an earlier challenge to anti-gay discrimination from the gay rights pioneer who recently passed away, I guess about a year or so ago, Frank Kameny, whose petition to the Supreme Court in 1961, protesting his 1957 dismissal from the U.S. Army, asserts, and he said, this is what he says, and I find it beautiful because it's so different from the language we hear now, and it's an older language. In his petition, it says, he asserts flatly, unequivocally, and absolutely uncompromisingly that homosexuality, whether by mere inclination or by overt act, is not only not immoral, but that for those choosing voluntarily to engage in homosexual acts, such acts are moral in a real and positive sense, and are good, right, and desirable, socially and personally. That's the end of the quote. So here, excuse me, there's not only the absence of a language of tolerance or acceptance, but an embrace of a gay positivity, for want of a better phrase. It's a very different kind of sentiment. Now, I want to talk just a few more minutes now about what I think underlies some of this discourse on tolerance. There's kind of, I mean, what I see now going on in contemporary culture is sort of a kind of tripod of ideas circulating. One is this tolerance idea, tolerance and acceptance. The other is gay marriage as the sign of all things freedom-loving, right? If we get this, it's all over. If we get this, then we can just pack up the movement and go home. And everyone can feel good about being non-homophobic, right? As if this is all there is to win, right? Forget hate crimes, forget violence, forget suicide, forget gay youth, gay marriage. And we can talk some more about that in the Q&A. And then the third part of that tripod is what I call the immutability problem, or the born this way idea. Now, if tolerance is our reigning ideology, our reigning way of understanding what it is to be a more embracing culture, then we see immutability, or the idea of the biological inevitability of sexual orientation, as the way to get there. There's not a talk I give, I'll say this, and I've been speaking on gay rights for a long time, and there is not a talk I give to any group in which that is not the way people think they're supposed to think. That good thinking people who support, equality, believe that the way that gay people are born that way. No one asked the question about whether straight people are born that way, which is an interesting point. No one's looking for the straight gene, which should tell us something about what we're how science works here. But not only do people believe that this is the truth of sexual orientation, but also that we must use those arguments about immutability, about biologically determined sexuality, in order to get rights. So in other words, the argument goes something like this: give me my rights because I can't help myself. Give me my rights because, like hair color, like eye color, like handedness, it just is genetically predetermined. Either predetermined biologically, through a combination of the endocrine system. There are all kinds of theories. Let me just tell you, one, it's terrible science. Right? It's just very weak science. But it also is a weak idea about how to get rights. Who cares how one is how one is? Why is that relevant? What difference does it make if you feel like you're born this way, you feel like you're not born this way? You're a part of this country, you pay your taxes, you're a citizen, you're deserving of rights. And to base rights on a notion of immutability has never been a good move historically. Right? Biological arguments, in fact, have often been used to oppress minority groups. Of course, the history of the Holocaust is one history of that. The history of biological arguments in the development of slavery and later Jim Crow laws. The biological arguments about women's inferiority biologically, and therefore they cannot be president. So biological arguments are a thin ground for social movements. But we have a problem here, and this is something I've had, really had trouble getting my head around, is that every poll shows that the more you believe that sexuality is predetermined or immutable or biologically, there in some way, the more likely you are to support gay rights. So we've got a problem with that because it's a really potent ideology. And it's seeped into everything, by the way. I mean, one of the things I did in this book is look at a lot of the transcripts from the legal cases, the gay marriage legal cases and so on. It's everywhere. Arguing for rights based on immutability, based on ideas of biological determination. And, again, we can talk some more about that, but it has been, I think the sort of gay gene, what I call the gay gene mania, is kind of linked historically with two other strands. One is the development of the Human Genome Project and the associated rise of neuroscience and neuropsychology and the move to frame everything in our culture, from shyness to food taste to falling in love, in biological and often genetic determinist ways. The other strand of why this is, why we're at this place of immutability, is a more complicated history that gay people themselves have had with this argument and with the origins, the notion of origins. And it's a complicated thing because I think on the one hand, what you don't want to do is set up a simplistic notion of choice versus nature versus nurture, right? It's either choice, I decided to put these shoes on today, just like I decided to be gay, right? That it's not choice. We don't want to think of anyone's sexuality in such a loose way. Choice in a simplistic notion of similar to what you choose to wear or you choose to eat a particular food. Everyone's sexuality, gay and straight, is a deeply felt experience and deeply held. But to say something is deeply held and experienced is very different than saying it's predetermined and locked in. People change their sexualities over lifetimes. People have different stories of how they come to their sexuality and how they know it. So the idea that there's one way to tell the story of gay identity, and that is through immutability, is part of the problem here. There are multiple ways to tell the story of how any of us, come to understand our sexual identities. But even further, the idea that we should root our rights, anyone's rights, on an idea of, you got to give me my rights because I'm born that way, is really thin. Because, of course, it can turn on a dime, can it? What if science comes around and says we can change that? We can unborn you that way. We can do something in utero to alter that. Let me give you an example of the dangers of this immutability argument, besides all the historical dangers that I'm sure you're aware of. There's a movement, and it's been completely discredited, but there's something called the reparative therapy movement. I don't know if people are familiar with that. And that's the idea started by completely discredited therapists that with the right kind of therapy, one can alter one's sexuality. And again, no one's looking to alter straight people's sexuality. This is about altering gay people's sexuality, turning them heterosexual. Now, one of the problems, this is one of the things that sparked my thinking about this and my thinking about this book, is one of the problems in the gay response to that has been, the gay rights, the gay movement's response to that, has been to say, why we oppose the reparative therapy movement because it's ineffectual, because it doesn't work, because you're born that way. Not we oppose it because it's immoral to ask someone to change how deeply felt they experience their sexuality. It's unethical. It's wrong. It's silly. But it's the most of the critique of it. There's an organization called, I think it's called Truth Wins Out, which is a gay rights organization that has fought the reparative therapy movement. And they fought it largely on the basis of immutability. They fought it because they say, reparative therapy people, you need to stop that because people can't change because they're born that way. Instead of saying, reparative therapy people, you need to stop that because it's a silly question. It's a silly practice. Who cares? Let people live their lives. How do they choose to live their lives? They're very different. So there are real-world implications for the idea of immutability. They're real-world dilemmas that a movement wrestles with when that becomes its normative way of thinking. And if there's, I mean, as I say, to me this is, as dominant a way of thinking in our culture now as anything is. So we have these two, tropes of immutability and tolerance. And it's interesting because, of course, the gay movement in earlier days wasn't interested in either of those. It was interested in notions of liberation, of freedom, of inclusion, and of really saying let me put it this way. Instead of saying, one of the things that tolerance and immutability, the arguments about tolerance and immutability do is they're negative arguments, right? It's like, oh, we'll tolerate that. Okay, we don't really like it. It's kind of yucky, but we're going to tolerate that. And immutability says, oh, well, okay, if you can't help yourself, I guess you get your rights. If it's just like your haircut, it's just benign, it doesn't mean anything. It just, you're forced to be that way, okay. That's very different than saying a positive sense of gay inclusion, gay integration, what gay ways of being, of doing gender, of creating communities, of creating families, what those ways can offer all of us, gay and straight alike. Tolerance is not that idea. Immutability is not that idea. It's very different from a notion of the celebration of difference, the embrace of difference, and exploring all that difference can bring to all of us, not just to in terms of a narrower terms of gay rights.